Great. Well, welcome everybody to another episode of Rhetoric Remix. This is a regular series of programs about all things rhetorical and on public speaking. And I get the great fun of talking to eminent practitioners, professors, leading speechwriters from around the world about some aspect of rhetoric or public speaking. This week, we have Lucinda Holdworth, who's a very eminent speechwriter in Australia. She's written for senior politicians and figures in business. And she's also written a highly acclaimed book, Leading Lines, on speechwriting. And so it's a great pleasure to both to have Lucinda, because of all her experience as a highly professional speechwriter, but also because we'll get a bit of a kind of an angle, if you like, from Australia. We haven't spoken to anyone from Australia in this series so far, so that's going to be a bit of fun as well. And Lucinda, I think, is going to be talking about persona in speeches. I hope she is, because that's what I'm expecting. And I think one of the more interesting questions in speech making and speech writing is, who do you want to be? Certainly I've found that in my own kind of activities. So I'd be fascinated to hear from Lucinda on, an overview of persona in speech making and speech writing and how that can affect and help us. So it's a great pleasure to have you here, Lucinda, and I'd love to hear your views.
Great to be here. Great to join everyone. Well, I wasn't planning on giving a speech, so why don't I make a few preliminary remarks, Simon, and then we can just have a conversation, don't you think?
Cool. Absolutely.
Yeah. So the idea of persona in speech writing, what does that mean? As a speech writer, for me, people often say to me as a speechwriter, how do you mimic the voice of the leader? How do you kind of ventriloquize the voice of a leader? And my answer to that is I don't. People don't want to work with a speechwriter to sound like themselves. They want to sound better than themselves, in fact. They want to sound like a version of their very best self. And so I usually think about speech writing for people as the voice of reason. That's the world I want to be in. So other speechwriters might have different goals, but that's mine. However, when you think about leaders themselves, as we know, Simon, you've written for lots of people as I have, and they do have different styles. And I think they do consciously or unconsciously adopt some persona that is often quite a deep one. So you might see the sort of general type persona, the person that talks in the language of strategy, tactics, amassing the troops, fighting and winning a victory. A really common persona is the coach. I think that's much more common now in business. People like to be a little bit more gentle. This is about, putting a team together, different skills, teamwork, collaboration, and so on. So that idea of, and when we think about that, we start to get different language, don't we? And different metaphors that would go into the speech. So if you're thinking, if you're working with a leader and you think, okay, this leader is more of a general, then you get into your kind of military metaphors. You start to think in terms of a kind of language world as well as just an idea of leadership. So that's really what I think of when I think of leadership persona.
And do you think it's reasonable and fair to say that we can choose different personas for our public life? I'm thinking of some fairly well-known politicians, say for instance in the UK, who it appears to me have chosen to have a persona. If you think about Tony Blair, his persona was encapsulated in the "I'm Tony, trust me." That very approachable, very nice, very likable person. Played the guitar probably at university. Was kind of everybody's favorite dude. And that's an example of a persona that he carried forward into politics. as the nice guy, the trust me. I wondered, what do you think about that? As can leaders adopt a persona, and is that reasonable?
I think leaders have to adopt persona. And I also think that it can sometimes be a huge challenge in politics. You see someone who's a really successful opposition leader, who's a great critic of government, and then they suddenly get into office. And the challenge then is to find this new kind of voice, the voice of a leader. It's very different, isn't it? And some people can't make that transition, and others do it beautifully. But the only way that they have to, that a language of anger, criticism, opposition, from that, and also vote getting, to when you're in charge, you're responsible, something big is happening and you have to respond to it. What a different world that is. So of course you have to draw on other resources, and they're often not internal resources that you have, actually. It's from outside yourself that you draw on different language, different models to succeed. So definitely.
Yeah, because I mean, I've been interested in Boris Johnson's persona for a while. He started off as a sort of bumbling professor type figure who threw in a bit of Latin or Greek into his speeches and generally confused everybody by his overall humor and his bonhomie, which of course doesn't really fit with being a prime minister, where you have to take rather tough and serious decisions, or with a prime minister in a pandemic. So I wondered what you thought about how you change your persona, if you can, as a leader, to match your different circumstances and situations.
Boris Johnson's such an interesting political figure, isn't he? I remember him coming down on the, what was it? Is it called a flying
the wire? Yes.
Yes. During his persona. It's a very strange thing, isn't it? I sort of almost have a visual idea of your kind of intellect, your size, your shape fitting the role. He was a great mayor. He was the right size personality for mayor. As you say, all those qualities, bonhomie, cheek, a kind of English, very English kind of advertising an idea of, well, to me, to an outsider, of Britain and of London, perfect for that. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Then when he became the Brexiteer, he did that, as an outsider just watching the sort of, from a cold-blooded professional point of view, from my expertise, he ran Brexit brilliantly. Then he becomes Prime Minister. He's got a vision, I think, of what sort of Prime Minister he's going to be. And that's been completely overturned now by the pandemic, completely overturned. And all those things that stood him in good stead, the humour and the cheek and the sort of relentless optimism, suddenly looks not right for the times. So how can he adapt? Can he adapt? That's the question.
And what about, I mean, I don't want to go on about the pandemic because, we've all talked about it all the time. But have you sort of observed different leaders taking on different styles and persona as a consequence? I mean, presumably they kind of would have to, wouldn't they?
Yeah, and some of them have had to sort of do it reluctantly, I think. The one that I really notice is, here in Australia where I am, the big shift that has occurred, it's really interesting to see, is most of the time politicians don't like having the experts standing around near them for reasons that mystify me, but they always like to appear like they know everything and they've got the agenda. With the pandemic, they're all too eager. And actually, it's a good thing to hand over to the scientists. So here in Australia, we usually see the medical expert standing next to either the Prime Minister or the Premier. They are using a very different form of language. This is the language of what do we know, what don't we know? What are we trying to find out? How will we know if we're doing well? By the way, if the evidence changes, we'll change our approach. This is completely different to kind of the blustering, macho approach that many of our politicians take, which is, I know best, here's what we're going to do. I've noticed some of that language now very beneficially seeping into public discourse, and I hope it lasts. a much more measured, much more reasonable way of speaking that doesn't profess to know everything and that looks more and more to the evidence rather than actually to values for the justification for action.
So you mentioned earlier a couple of types of leadership persona, the general, the coach, and so on. Are the sort of new types then emerging? I mean, you know, the kind of influence of the scientist, is that changing leadership persona in any way?
Yeah, I wonder. I'll be very interested to see. I mean, the other persona that have been working well in this era, I've noticed, is people drawing on the kind of, leaders who might appear erratically or might appear on major occasions. What we've seen is now they've had to many leaders have had to appear daily. So, for instance, in America, Mario Cuomo, whose name was never heard in Australia, has become this kind of figure in Australia because of his appearance with his slides every night. And what I noticed about that is the power of a repetitious format in a time of change and crisis. So, so by just being like a kind of newsreader, appearing every day, doesn't even matter what the format is. He just appears in the same format every day. And when we're all anxious and stressed, that is strangely reassuring, just having the leader turn up. And I think in the UK, I think you have three microphones, is it? And you have the leader. And I see that and I think, right, that's them coming out and they're going to talk about the virus and where they're up to, and that's strangely, oddly reassuring. The other persona that's really come out is what I think of as the good parent persona. And that's really brilliantly exemplified by Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. And she's kind of like the good parent, sets boundaries, isn't afraid to scold, isn't interested really in empathizing with what's going on. Like a good parent doesn't empathize with the child. They're ahead of the child. They're saying, this is for your own good. You're not going to like it. It's uncomfortable. I'm making this decision. Here's what I expect of you. Here's how you can contribute. And that is also, I think, a very powerful and effective persona in this time. Going ahead, though, Simon, I mean, we're entering a new world, aren't we? And I was discussing this with my husband. I said, what are the future kind of personae? He said, maybe it's the expedition leader, the person that sort of carries the flag into the future. Is that a new kind of persona that might develop? And I think as writers and as people thinking about speech writing, we should not be afraid to dream about what other models there might be.
Sure. Is persona something that you talk about openly with clients and so on? I mean, I return to that question, which I will do so again, but that who do you want to be question, I found very valuable. And I just wonder whether you actually address it, openly like that.
Usually not, actually, because I don't really have. Freelancing, I'm not close enough. I'll be interested to hear what you think about this. But there have been some leaders though when I've worked with one leader for a long time when they were new, and I was the experienced speechwriter. And I asked them who they admired and who they saw, what kind of leader that they admired. And that gave me some clues as to what kind of model. But in Australia, generally there's a fairly narrow range. People are so conservative. So nearly every business guy I've worked with will say Steve Jobs. It's just an automatic. And in a way, it's not helpful because most of them seriously are not Steve Jobs. So I just have to take that and sort of park it in a corner and then work with what I've got, really.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very useful way to look at how to frame what you're going to say. And I'd be interested to know whether you think you can do it for different audiences even. But certainly I found that that question of who do you want to be focuses people, and it also gives them a longer vision for speeches and speech making than simply the one-off.
Yes.
That they're looking at their public persona, if you like. And I think that can help both in terms of positioning themselves, their company, and looking at it as something that they want to develop over time, so that each speech addresses that question.
But what sort of responses do you get when you ask someone, who do you want to be? I mean, do they say, I want to be Winston Churchill? What do they say? I want to be Tony Blair? Like what sort of...
Well, it's normally defensive and kind of, nobody's ever asked me that before.
Yes.
But of course, it is a light bulb moment. And I don't know about you, but most of the time when you ask things like that or do things like that, you don't get a sort of straightforward reaction from people, but you have lit a little bit of inspiration somewhere around. And it doesn't have to be with leaders. For instance, in making a social speech, I think it can be a very helpful way to address nerves.
Do you know? Yeah, and you've just reminded me, a very good friend of mine is a fiction writer, and she wrote a book that caused, I'm not going to mention her name, but she wrote a book that caused a huge stir after many years kind of toiling away. And she very consciously thought about that question, who do I want to be? And she said she decided that she wanted to be like the women she admired in public life, who were calm and authoritative. And that was very interesting for me to hear, because I could see how that helped her. That sort of set a standard in her mind of what she was aiming for. And in a strange way, people talk about authenticity, but by actually having that artificial idea, that helped her find something very centered within herself. And she comes across as very authentic and sincere, grounded, and it's helped her having that who do I want to be question in her mind.
Yeah, exactly, because personality isn't just a single trait, is it? I mean, we are different people in different circumstances in any case in our lives. We're different in the pub to when we're talking in a lecture hall or whatever. So
absolutely,
we adopt different personalities and persona quite naturally
and appropriately. I mean, the role that we play, if we're a colleague or a boss, I mean, that's why someone who's a leader of the opposition and then becomes prime minister, they have to find a new they have to broaden and deepen their persona, and it can be very challenging for some people to do. And actually, some people just do it so brilliantly. I'm astonished at how mobile human beings can be when required to go into a new role and to take it on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I just wondered, I mean, this is sort of slightly going back a few years, but the notion of, Aristotle talks about ethos as, kind of a cornerstone of making a speech. Do you think he was getting at the idea of persona in speech making? How you come across, and that could change?
Definitely.
It seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, that's ethos is by far. So as we know, Aristotle said that there's three elements to the task of persuasion. There's using logic, logos, reasoned argument. The second is pathos, which is evoking the right emotions in your audience to get them to be activated in the way that you aim for. And the third is ethos, which means something like, I think, character or credibility. But people often think that means some sort of permanent, authentic, unchanging state. But as you say, what he's really talking about is the contingent world of persuasion. That is, having the credibility to give the argument for this audience on this day, yes, in this context, to achieve this particular purpose. And that is a changing thing, isn't it?
Yes, it's a fascinating balance when one thinks about the idea of persona. Of, if you address the who do you want to be, you've got to have this long-term vision of the person that you want to project, but also subtly change that for different circumstances and moods.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the big examples that we think of history, it can work two ways, can't it? If we think of someone like Winston Churchill, who won the Second World War and everyone remembers him and his great speeches and so on, but in 1945 he was thrown out. And that was because I think the British people thought he had so strongly identified with the ethos to win a war that he could not, in their view, so this is a perception, be the guy that was the right guy to lead them through a period of reform necessary in the peace. So you can see that ethos question really was he assumed he was going to win that election. To give another example, though, you can actually win ethos through great speech making. You can win credibility. Right. So when Barack Obama got up in, 2004, and said, there's not a black America and a white America, there's a United States of America, and a whole audience of people just said, well, that's going to be the next president. That's our guy. So what I love about a great speech and speech making is you can create ethos through fantastic speech making, in fact. You can demonstrate your credibility for the big role that you want to play.
Yes, I suppose that's why we return again and again and again to speech writing, not speech making, not just because we value the sharing of ideas, because it's a very public way of testing the character and mettle of the person.
Yeah.
That it's one of our best ways of seeing who's really who. In public life.
It's such a, for me, I labour the point in my book, Leading Lines, it's the democratic methodology. Rhetoric came to the fore in democratic Athens, 500 BC. And that was, why do we even have speech making? It's because if you're a tyrant, then you don't need to persuade people, you just use force. But all of us who live in a democracy and want to live in a democracy know that words are our tools to make things happen, to make things change.
Yeah.
So, it's a vital element in democratic societies, and still tremendously effective as a way of, as you say, sorting out who are the right people, what ideas should we follow, how, where do we go from here, and what better way?
Yeah. You mentioned language earlier, which is a kind of an area of fascination for me, language in speeches and the tropes and the kind of imagery. You were talking about the way that a different persona requires a different language, I think. But I wondered what you thought about the way that different types of speeches affect the persona that's coming across. If one thinks of a great example from antiquity, Mark Antony talking at Caesar's funeral, because of that twist in the rhetorical language that he uses, I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him, and he goes through that twist all the time, that presents him as a very different type of person, a very humble person, just through the use of a particular type of rhetorical manner. I just wondered what, I love that kind of, what does language do to people?
Absolutely. And we have, Shakespeare was a master, wasn't he, at showing kind of all these layers of psychology and how persuasion works so powerfully. The choice of language that we use can make an extraordinary difference, in fact. And what dismays me about most modern speech making is that so much of it is cardboard cutout language. So it's the jargon of business and the jargon of political correctness and the jargon of politics. And we hear these words and they just wash over us. We don't wake up. We're sort of half asleep the whole time because the imagery is so stale. The language is so stale. One reason why I think I watched Boris Johnson is because of the vivid energy of his language and his funniness and his kind of his erudition, which meant that he's got sort of layers in his speech making that for someone like me wakes me up, makes me take notice, whether I agree or disagree. So a lot of people just, I think, in public life, and I'm talking about people who want to enter public life, are very cautious about language, are very lacking in the readiness to sort of use a metaphor or an image in a different way, to play with language. And that means they don't make an impact, actually, very much. So, yeah, and what is it? It's a homogenization of our education system, and it's also natural caution. People are afraid to be different in the way they speak.
And yet, when the example you gave of Barack Obama, I mean, that phrase, you know, United States, I mean, that's fresh language, isn't it? The reason why it said, and the whole "yes, we can" reverberating through that speech, like the line of a pop song, it was totally fresh, new, different. Sadly, I think he lost that freshness under the weight of office, but that speech is a classic example of new language, new man.
Yes, and it's also a very interesting example of ethos. I mean, it's really fresh language. It's very inspiring, obviously, and it's also to do with how ethos works, which is it's a Black American man saying these words. So you know, it's the package, isn't it? It's what you present all together. And he did as you know, as president, he had just the political problems of not having control of both houses of his parliament. And once you've got that, then you're actually stuck in the position where you end up having to be a commentator on what's going on rather than the driver of events. And Bill Clinton had that problem as well. So that deficiencies, which I think we can see now in their presidential achievements, and I'm sure they would agree, were partly because they're battling those forces politically. But that freshness of language, fresh imagery, and also I think it's that other aspect of ethos, which goes with another term from rhetoric, a classical term, kairos, picking the time, seizing the moment, you know. I think we go back to Julius Caesar, which is there's a tide in the affairs of man, you know, that sense of at this moment, what are the words that need to be said? And what we often find, what I've found with many leaders is they're scared to say the thing that hasn't been said before. And it's like, that's why you're the leader. You're going to say it. You are going to say this thing that's hard because that's what leaders do. You're going to say the new thing, that because your job is to see a little bit further into the future than everyone else and take us there through language.
Yes, exactly. And I return to Kennedy's moon speech. You know, we choose to go to the moon. He didn't say we are going to. You know, we choose to go to the moon. It was an act of kind of human endeavor, which I love, and that gave language to the dream.
Yeah, really. Absolutely. And the other part of that speech that I really love, there's a strange riff at the end where he says, we choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard. But then at the end, he has this thing of, I think we're going to do it in this decade, but it might be hard. But anyway, it's going to be done and it will be done. So there's all this stepping forward, going back in the language. And I love that part of that speech because it almost enacts the process of trial and error that would be necessary. So he's foreshadowing for his people, this is not going to be something I'm not going to snap my fingers. It will be, and I think he says there's a price and we will be paying the price that needs to be paid. It's not specific, but in those words, he foreshadows the dangerous adventure that the nation is going to embark upon.
Yes, that's a fascinating example of the very language of the speech kind of mimicking the reality of what's taking place. It's so
masterly and so kind of deceptive. And, you know, I always think you can't tell whether people often say, was that a good speech or not? And I feel a bit like one of those sort of Chinese premiers saying it's too early to tell, ask me in 1,000 years, because you often don't really know whether the speech has done what it needed to do until you've seen how events play out, whether the leader got what they were aiming for. And sometimes that's not clear straight away.
Yes, time does tell all that. And just to return to that notion of kairos, so often it is the moment that makes the speech, isn't it? I mean, you know, I think very, very few great political leaders are remembered for the lines of their speeches. You know, we can probably number them on the fingers of one hand, really, other than Churchill or Roosevelt or whatever. But you know, Tony Blair's probably remembered for the speech he gave in the morning after the death of Princess Diana, for instance. And that, you know, so it is that moment, seize the moment.
Yes, yeah, and capture it. And I mean, you know, there have been some of the most extraordinary speeches have been things like when there was that Florida gun shooting, there was a group of young people that got up and gave some speeches, and they were just extraordinary speeches. So that was almost like they were ready. And even in the Black Lives Matter situation, where families have lost someone and they've gotten up and given these extraordinary speeches. And what's that? That's to do with the time, the moment. It's to do with I think often the urgency of the message that they want to send. So you often can feel the heat coming off a speaker if there's a sense that they have a really clear mission for their speech. And that sometimes that's not going to come from politicians. That will come from people that want some specific social change. Greta Thunberg's another speaker, amazingly powerful speaker, because she's got this very clear single message she's sending.
Yes, and I one of the sort of exercises I've done in the past is to compare speeches given by different speakers about kind of the same topic, if you like, every time. I'm thinking of, for instance, American presidents speak once every 10 years on the anniversary of the D-Day landings, and typically it's a big speech given on the coast of northern France, and it's been fascinating to mark the difference, you know, from Reagan, the great speech of "These are the boys of Pointy Hawk," to you know, it almost makes you want to cry thinking about it, to you know, the sort of subsequent ones, which are very much more matter of fact. So that's a very interesting way into looking at the person
and the times, isn't it? So yes, for us here, so that Peggy Noonan speech for Reagan is one of, I mean, she was a fantastic speechwriter for him. She was the great, you know, match for him for some of his key speeches. In Australia, we have the Gallipoli anniversary each year. Yes. And each year a whole lot of people get up, and I've written some of the speeches, and most of the time they wash over you because people just say the same stuff. But every now and then someone says something that just, you know. So Paul Keating, who had a fantastic, Prime Minister Paul Keating had a fantastic speechwriter. Don Watson gave a marvellous speech. He gave a speech on the tomb of the unknown soldier, in which for the first time our Prime Minister didn't sort of glorify war, but talked a little bit in the same language about the boys, the Australian boys. So you do have that. I love to compare them, because I think, would I have written one of the good ones, or would I have written one of the kind of ordinary ones, or, you know, would I be good enough for that? You know, I get a kind of anxiety and tension about, could I do that? Would I be up for that?
I think there's no doubt you would, Lucinda. I'm sure you would write one of the great ones. Well, thank you so much. I mean, this has been just a fab chat, and I hope one that we'll be able to kind of repeat, and we'll come back to different aspects and subjects of the great topic of rhetoric at some stage in the future. But it's been such a pleasure, and such a a delight to have your energy and knowledge here. And thanks so much, and we'll look forward to more chats about Australia as well.
Thank you, Simon.
All right. Cheerio. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.